Welcome, everyone. We have got a fantastic lineup for you today. We're talking about food from the forest, and we're only a mere minute or so away from getting started. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff Jensen, Director of Community Programs here with Trees Forever, and I have one of our field coordinators, Gina Buelow from Central Iowa, here to help me, and we're really excited to talk about all sorts of different foods from the forest. Now, Nick McGrath was supposed to be with us here, but he unfortunately couldn't due to a death in the family. And so our thoughts and prayers are out to Nick, and he'll be back here next week, but travel day today. So you get Gina and I have 12 noon. So that means I think that we can go ahead and get started. I want to say thank you and welcome Jeff Jensen, Director of Community Programs here with Trees Forever. This is a fantastic Our Woodland Legacy webinar where we're focusing on food from the forest. Wanted to have you save the date because we have a couple of other Our Woodland Legacy webinars coming up here in August. Really excited for the 16th. We're going to have Mark Raubach talking about Iowa's biggest trees. And boy, he's got an update and he's discovered some trees, and of course other trees die or get damaged, and so he's updated his list from a couple of years ago. That's going to be a fascinating presentation and a lot of fun. And then towards the end of August, we're going to talk about the ticking time bomb of controlling invasive species. So we have a lot of issues with invasive species all throughout our woodlands, and so Timon Feely with Iowa DNR, invasive species specialist, he's going to be joining us for an in-depth talk about all those different invasive species we find in the woods and how we can control them. Also wanted to make a plug here for a Steward of the Beautiful Land webinar coming up on August 9th over the noon hour. We're going to have Tolliff Hunt with the University of Northern Iowa, and he's going to be talking about managing prairie, and so that's going to be a lot of fun. And then we have some field days, an opportunity to get out with us and enjoy the outdoors. In August, we have several opportunities looking at roadsides, playing prairie bingo. We're going to be up in Okoboji on the 8th. We're going to be over in Carroll County on the 9th. Again, on the 9th, we're going to be in Franklin County at the Mains Grove Lodge by Hampton. And then later in the 12th, we're going to be down in Mahaska County at the Environmental Learning Center on that Saturday. So lots of opportunities for you to come out and join Trees Forever and learn some really cool things about our native outdoors. With that, let's jump into Food Forest Forum. We're talking about foods from the forest today, and I'm going to get started with a little presentation here on some options, nut and fruit options for folks perhaps in their backyard or what they could actually maybe glean from the forest. Gina, is that coming through loud and clear? Can you see that?
Yep, we can see your screen.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's jump into it. So Trees Forever's mission, just real quickly, is to plant and care for trees and the environment by empowering people, building community, and promoting stewardship. We have over 30 years of award-winning programs. We have a staff of roughly 22 working in Iowa and Illinois. Since our inception, we've planted over 3.4 million trees, and honestly, we're supported by individuals like you. So thank you very much for being a supporter of Trees Forever. We do appreciate it. So before we get started with a couple of specific examples, I just want to set the stage here in the context and just have us think back in time, maybe early ancestors or even before, and think about all of the bounty that the forests would provide. From fruits and nuts that all we had to do was glean them off the floor of the forest floor, like in this picture here with this young boy who's proudly showing off some hickories and maybe some black walnuts, some persimmons there maybe. And so if we go back far enough in time, this was just a way of life for us. Now, as time progresses and modernity brings on all sorts of new things like shopping from home and having food delivered right to your door, it's not too late to go back and think to yourselves and experience that there's a lot of great things that I can either grow in my backyard or I can do some foraging and are really great in terms of tasting good and good for us as well. So let's jump into a few of these specifics. Hey, black walnuts, Most of us are aware of black walnuts. They are native to all 99 Iowa counties, prized for their nuts and their lumber. Most of us are probably familiar with them as a nuisance. All sorts of folks contact me and say, hey, what do I do about these black walnuts? I want to get rid of them. And so we say, well, certainly you can pick them up with a nut wizard. That's the little rolling cages, rolling ball cages that are really effective at picking up those big nuts in the husk there. But they can also be eaten. Selected varieties can actually have up to 30% nut meats, so it's actually worth cracking them and then getting that nut meat out. And there's actually, believe it or not, quite a few new uses and products being developed from black walnuts. I know it's hard to believe, but all sorts of different things. So real quickly about growing black walnuts, they are going to like well-drained soil, a neutral pH. Now they are susceptible to late spring frosts because they are one of the last trees to break dormancy. And of course they can self-pollinate, but cross-pollination is much better. And when we think about that, more along on a commercial line of things, it's important to think through overlapping pollination times. In the wild black walnuts that we'd find in our woodlands and in our streets and our cities, they're going to be wild black walnuts, and their percent kernel might be 10 to 15%. And they're going to have random pollination times, but it's when we get into those different varieties like the sparrows or the quick crops, some of those, where we have to ensure that we get good pollination. And of course, selecting a pollinator to ensure that we get pollination is important because without it, we're not going to get those nuts. Now, you might want that. That might be your ideal situation, a nice big shade tree that doesn't drop black walnuts, but in our cities and in most of our woodlands, there's still going to be that pollen source there to be able to produce those nuts. And here's what it looks like right on the tree itself. This is a nice one here from the University of Missouri. I was actually just down at the Northern Nut Growers annual conference held down in Columbia, Missouri, where they have a research farm. And of course, underneath that green husk is going to be the nuts themselves, very tough nuts to crack. And then here's what I was talking about with those kernels. So when we get into some of these selected varieties, boy, we get some really nice quarter pieces. These jars have some varieties labeled so that you can see not only the experimental genotype with that number 8-.1588, but then how big some of those kernel pieces are. 5.2 grams, 5.9 grams. Those are nice big pieces that are going to be easier to process, and then better for folks because they can eat them as nice big pieces instead of just little granules. And then we have, of course, all the different products that we can make from black walnuts. They're great as a snack. Certainly, they've got this bold, wild flavor. They can be utilized. Now, Hammond's, which is one of the biggest black walnut processors in the United States, originally got started because they just wanted the shell. And the shell is used for everything from sandblasting to dynamite to oil drilling, you name it. The shells have all sorts of uses. But more recently, they've been focusing on the black walnut meats because there's starting to become more and more of a following where folks want high quality black walnut meats in all of their baked goods, in a lot of their savory dishes, things like that. And then you get into some of the really neat value-added products. Who's heard of black walnut beer? I had never heard of it until just not even a week ago. This was on the silent auction down at the Northern Nut Growers. This is an ale brewed with black walnuts. I did not get a chance to taste it, but I am really interested to see what that's all about. Something I did get a chance to taste, however, was the nocino. Now this nocino is a black walnut liqueur, traditionally from Italy, but they are producing it here in the United States now. And this is something that I had some of this right here in the center of the screen, some of this nocino, a little bit of, just a little bit, less than a shot glass certainly, and boy, it's got a kick to it, let me tell you what. So a lot of folks will actually brew their own nocino. So you have the commercial product, but there's also then the home brewed product that a lot of folks will make themselves. So that's black walnuts. For some more information, here's a couple of resources from the University of Missouri Agroforestry Center, Iowa Nut Growers, and then the Walnut Council. Hey, let's talk about hazelnuts. I grow hazelnuts on my farm. I grow hybrid hazelnuts, and these are the shrubs that are native to the Midwest. European hazelnuts are going to grow as trees, and they're going to be the hazelnuts you'll see out in Oregon, for example, that grow the great big giant nuts that you'll see at the holidays, have the really thin shells. This is an emerging new crop that's great for humans and wildlife alike. Here's an example of what it's going to look like, the structure of the multi-stemmed shrubs. And actually, this is one that I would consider what's called a dense upright form. So this has a crown where a lot of the main suckers are coming out, but then it really does open up and it does stand upright. Conversely, you can get some plants like this one where it's, I call it more of a wide splayed form, and that's not necessarily a function of the heavy laden branches. So certainly when you get a heavy year, there's a lot of nuts on those branches. They're gonna be weighed down. But even without that, some plants are going to have a structure that's more of a wide splayed form versus that dense upright form. We don't know enough to select for it at this point, but it is something that folks might be interested in if they're using it, for example, as a windbreak or a shelter, or not shelter, but more of a visual break between like neighbors or something like that. You might want that dense upright form to be a larger shrub that's going to stand up and provide that privacy screening or whatever the case may be. They do grow as a bush. You can get production in 3 to 5 years. They do like well-drained soil. Most of our nuts and fruit trees are going to like well-drained soil, and they don't self-pollinate. They need at least 2 plants to cross-pollinate. They grow, the nuts will grow in a husk like this, where there may be 1 nut in the husk. Could be up to 4, 5, 6 nuts in a husk. And then, of course, these are the round, hard in-shell nuts that we eventually want to get to. From there, you can see the kernel next to the little quarter there. That's the ultimate prize, that kernel. And that kernel is 50% oil by weight. And hazelnut oil is almost identical to olive oil, one of our healthiest cooking oils. And so that's very important because it allows us then to essentially substitute 1-for-1 olive oil for hazelnut oil. And olive oil demands a premium in the market. In fact, hazelnut and olive oil are so similar that the Europeans had to develop a DNA test because olive oil was being cut or adulterated with hazelnut oil, and they couldn't tell the difference because their fatty acid profile is almost identical. It's a monounsaturated, one of our healthiest oils. So great for baking, for cooking, not for deep frying or anything like that. Doesn't have a real high smoke point. So, but the kernels, that's what we want. And here we can roast those kernels, and they're absolutely delicious. And then, of course, they can be used in a wide range of products. Most folks are familiar with Nutella, but the oil itself, and then that oil can be put into everything from shampoos and soaps and lotions to then hazelnut bread you can see there. And of course, hazelnuts really do go good with chocolate. I think there's just no denying that. So excuse me, for some more information, here's the Iowa Nut Growers Association link, the Upper Midwest Hazelnut Development Initiative, and then the Hazelnut Consortium out there in Nebraska. One of my favorite nuts. I grow hazelnuts, but I love pecans. So when we're talking about pecans here, we're really at the northern edge of the range. Southern Iowa is going to be the northern edge of the pecan growing range. Now we do have some northern pecans, much smaller in size than some of these commercial varieties. But the thing with pecans is even if you're in central Iowa or northern Iowa, pecans can make wonderful shade trees. So they really are multi-purpose. So if I want to grow a couple of pecans as shade trees, maybe they're not going to produce nuts because it's simply too cold up there by the Minnesota border, but with enough time and as zones continue to shift further north, maybe someday they will produce some nuts. Now, if you want to get nuts, if that is your desire, you absolutely must match the varieties to different pollinators because pollination overlap is relatively narrow for pecans. and you need to ensure that you're going to have enough pollination to get nuts by matching that pollinator that's going to shed pollen at the same time as those female flowers are receptive to it. Here's an example of a large, over 100-year-old pecan tree. Like I said, they can make nice shade trees, really nice structure, leaves. You can see the gentleman there, that's Ralph Voss with Voss Pecans by the red arrow, just for scale. So they can be very large trees and need to be given some room as they do grow older. Again, these pecans are going to need well-drained soil, not cold hardy for many locations north of Interstate 80. If you want nuts, again, can be nice shade trees. Wind pollinated, so you're going to need at least 2 trees to pollinate, and then of course having that overlap. And then if you do grow pecans for nuts, they do require pretty heavy fertilizer, because you're taking off quite a bit of nutrients when you pull those nuts off with the husks and all those different things. But for a backyard person with just a couple of nuts or a single tree or two, not going to be such an issue. This is what they look like when they're growing right about now, actually. They have this husk around them, and then eventually that husk will break, usually in quarters, and then inside of there is going to be the hard in-shell nut. Here's what they look like before they're cracked. And pecans, one of my favorite nuts, absolutely. And all sorts of things that we can make from pecans. They're, of course, wonderful in ice cream and baked goods, but there's some toasted pecan syrup. So kind of amazing what we can do with all these different products. A bit more information there for pecans. So let's pivot here a little bit to a couple of fruits. Want to talk about Aronia berries. A lot of folks are maybe familiar with Aronia berries. They are the Aronia melanocarpa, referred to previously, before they were kind of renamed Aronia berry, the black chokeberry. And you can probably see why they changed the name. It's going to be tough to market something named a black chokeberry, because it does have that astringent taste that can make you kind of pucker up a little bit. But Aronia berries are very, very productive here in the Midwest. A single shrub can produce up to 10, 15, maybe even 20 pounds of these little berries here. They do grow as a shrub, a multi-stemmed shrub. They have these beautiful flowers that can be whitish or pinkish in May. And then, of course, they do get the fruit, the Aronia berries themselves, that grow in clusters. Relatively easy to harvest, very productive. You can see in this kind of a mess here, all of these different clusters of berries. Let me zoom in a little. There we go. You can see a much better indication here of just what they look like. Some folks think of them as little mini tiny apples. They kind of have that look to them. And just shrubs can be absolutely loaded with these berries. Now, a lot of folks, would say, once you taste an Aronia berry, they would say, oh my goodness, why are you growing these things? Well, Aronia berries, their claim to fame is they have the highest level of antioxidants of just about any other fruit out there. So the USDA Ag Research Service did a study looking at black currants, the red currants, the gooseberries, elderberries, and then the Aronia berries, and it showed that the Aronia berries had the highest levels of anthocyanins. And so there was a test developed called this ORAC value test, that stands for oxygen radical absorption capacity, and it's really kind of a measurement of antioxidant capacity. And you can see the chart here. And Aronia berry does really blow everything else out of the water. You can see elderberry does have high levels as well, but nowhere near Aronia berry. So they're a brain food, a healthy food for us to consume, certainly. It's just too bad that they taste so bad. But you put enough sugar with just about anything, and you can make it taste all right, I guess. So, of course, they have uses in jams and jellies and juice, wines, pies, pastries, salsa, syrups, barbecue sauce. You can put them in a lot of different things. Of course, we like to bake with them. If you put them in the freezer and freeze the berries, that can break down the tannins in the fruit, which are what gives it kind of that astringent taste. So we usually do take our berries, put them in big Ziploc bags, put them in the freezer, and then pull them out and use them as we need them. And it makes them a little bit milder for our smoothies, pancakes, muffins, whatever we decide. For a little bit more information, visit the Midwest Aronia Association there. They've got a lot of great stuff. And I don't know why my other links didn't come up. University of Connecticut has a breeding program, doing a lot of good work with that. Of course, University of Missouri down there at the Agroforestry Center doing some work with Aronias too. And then there's the actual entity that's selling Aronias, which is the Midwest Aronia Association. Honeyberries. This one's really interesting, and one that I wasn't even aware of until probably 5 years ago. These are also called Canadian haskaps, and they are a member of the honeysuckle family, and that's a little bit concerning, but they don't tend to sucker, which is good in terms of keeping any sort of potential invasive species at bay. They taste great. Not all of them taste great, but they are easy to grow, good for U-pick operations. That's what a lot of the Canadian folks up there in Saskatchewan are doing. When I say they taste great, not all of them, is because there's been a lot of breeding that has taken place with these honeyberries in Japan and Russia. Of course, in Japan, they were breeding mostly for sweetness to get a nice sweet berry. However, in Russia, they were actually breeding them for more of an astringency to maybe use as a vodka ingredient. And so there's a wide range of tastes with some of these different varieties, from very sweet to a little bit milder. It's been explained to me that it's kind of a cross between a blueberry and a raspberry, and I think that's probably a fair description in terms of what it tastes like. What's really interesting is they are cold hardy, but they're so early ripening. So they're typically ready to harvest before strawberries even, and then they're completely done by mid-July. Some varieties are done even before the end of June. So that's just really unique in terms of, if you're thinking about extending the season, boy, this is something that's going to be flowering in May, and it's going to be putting on berries, and you're harvesting in June, and then everything's done. So if you are looking to get some of the berries, you do need a different variety for pollination, and then certainly mulch pretty heavy. You can see what they look like here, and there is a little bit of a range in terms of the size of the berries by some of the different varieties that are out there. This is what they look like. These are producing shrubs, roughly 3 feet tall, and they get anywhere from 3 to 6 feet and 2 to 4 feet in diameter. They do prefer full sun, although there are some experiments looking at growing them under shade cloth to replicate or mimic maybe an understory crop. Like most things, the less sun, the less fruit that you get, so that's always a trade-off. This is the fruit spread throughout the entire shrub there, you can see. Honeyberry jam is delicious. This was the taste test challenge at one of the honeyberry field days I attended. And then here's Deb at Little Deb's Berry Farm with some of the jam that she sells. They've had a couple of different field days, and actually there's a great video on the Iowa Nut Growers Association YouTube, as well as the the Trees Forever YouTube page, where you can see a little bit more about Little Deb's Berry Farm. So those are honeyberries in a nutshell. And with that, that's going to wrap up a couple of options for foods from the forest. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here real quick and allow Gina to pull up her presentation.
All right. So I am going to be looking at a little bit of a different view. So Jeff focused mostly on plants, nuts and berries, but I'm going to be looking at a completely different sector of life. We're going to be looking at fungi. So when we're thinking about what a mushroom is, it's part of this tree of life. We have several different categories that make up life. So we have prokaryotic organisms, which are things like bacteria and archaea. They're single-celled organisms, pretty simple in their composition. And then we have organisms in the category eukaryota. These organisms can be multicellular. They're a little bit more complicated in their cell structure. And we're going to be talking about fungi. So fungi includes things like mushrooms, which are multicellular fungi. There are also unicellular fungi called yeast, which we use a lot in cooking. And one thing I want to point out is that fungi are actually more closely related to animals than they are plants, even though that's not something we would think intuitively based on kind of their lifestyle, where they're not moving around like animals, but they are closely related to us. So when we're thinking about mushrooms, I'm just going to go through kind of the anatomy of an ideal mushroom. So we have the cap, and on the cap there might be some texture like scales or wrinkles. Then underneath the cap we have this surface that holds the spores. So this surface might contain gills, and between those gills are the spores. It might be kind of a porous texture, and that's where the spores are kept, or sometimes even spines. Mushrooms tend to have a stem or a stalk. And when mushrooms are emerging from the earth, sometimes they emerge from almost like an egg-like case and kind of sprout out of it. Not every mushroom does, but some of them do. So this is really our ideal mushroom. When you're picturing a mushroom, you think of this capped mushroom. Not every mushroom looks like this, and I'll go into a couple examples when we're talking about what you can grow yourself. Some of them are pretty wacky looking mushrooms compared to our ideal mushroom. But one thing I want to point out is that this fruiting body, which is everything I just described, that is just the tip of the iceberg. So underneath this fruiting body, there is mycelium, and mycelium is everywhere. It has relationships with plants a lot of the time to help plants absorb nutrients better. But it's this feathery white, almost root-like structure. And on the mycelium, there are little nodes called hyphae, and the hyphae reaches out and absorbs the nutrients around it through enzymes. It leaches that nutrients back to the mushroom. So picking mushrooms is actually pretty sustainable for the organism, just because when it's a fruiting body, it's almost, completely through its life. There's still, all that mycelium underground. So one thing I like to tell people, if you are someone that forages mushrooms outdoors, if you find a mushroom, put a pin on your phone of where you found it. And likely in a couple weeks, there's going to be more fruiting bodies there. So when I go to parks, I usually pull up my phone and I have different locations of where I found different mushrooms. So when we're thinking about mushrooms that we can eat, which is what we're going to be talking about today, because most people don't want to grow mushrooms that they can't eat, there are different categories. We have edible and choice mushrooms, which are the ones that are excellent for eating, that are super popular. Then we have edible mushrooms, and these mushrooms aren't as good as the choice mushrooms. They might be criticized for not having amazing flavors. We also have non-edible mushrooms, which are not necessarily poisonous, but not something you should eat. They might be super fibrous. They might give some people tummy aches. So that's another classification we use. And then we have poisonous mushrooms, which we do not eat. So the mushrooms I'm going to be talking about that you can grow, they're going to be our edible and choice mushrooms. My recommendation is that you should never eat a mushroom that you're not 100% certain on what it is. Just because there are things that kind of look like edible mushrooms, but might be poisonous. So we just stay with things that we're sure on. So I'm going to talk about propagating mushrooms. So this means growing mushrooms. And there's several different ways that you can propagate mushrooms, and I'll bring you through some of those options. So two organizations or companies that I'm going to be referring to a lot. One is called North Spore, and they do a lot of work with propagating mushrooms. I believe they're out of Minnesota, but I might be wrong. They're in a cold state. I know that for sure. But we also have Joy Grow, which is out of Cambridge, Iowa. So that's really close to us. And the reason I know about Joy Grow is because they are at the farmers market every weekend in Ames. And they sell mushrooms that they are growing in little trays, and they'll sell them pre-picked, or you can buy these big blocks of mushrooms so you can grow them at home. So these are the two organizations that I'll be talking about, but there's many, many, many more. I just chose Joy Grow because it's close, and then North Spore because I've bought from them before. So I'm going to go from probably the most complicated way to grow your own mushrooms to the most simple way. So the first way is through log and stump inoculation. So this is where you buy mushroom spawn. So you buy a specific species of mushroom that you want to grow, and they send you the spores and the mycelium. And then you grow it in a log or a stump of a dead tree. So you drill holes in the log or the stump, and you stick that spawn in there, and you cover that hole with wax to keep bad bacteria out and also to control humidity. And then between 6 months to 2 years, you get mushrooms growing on that log or stump. And the good thing about this is once you pick the mushrooms off the stump, it will likely produce another flush of mushrooms, another generation of mushrooms. So this is something that a lot of these large scale operations use to grow mushrooms. The downside to this is, from what I can tell, it needs to be kind of a freshly dead tree that you're using. You can't just use any log out there. So if you have a storm that knocks down a tree, that might be a good one to get logs from. If you're thinning out a woodland for management purposes, that might be a good option if you want to get logs. There is also a guide on what types of trees you should be using for each type of mushroom that you want to grow. With this methodology, you can grow a lot of different mushrooms, more than you can grow with other propagation techniques that I'll be covering in a little bit. Some of the most popular types of trees that people use are oak trees and then hard maple trees. But they have this entire list of recommended trees to use for these different mushroom species. And it goes a lot farther past this list that I have. The list was very, very long. I had to crop it to fit it in the PowerPoint. So it is a pretty comprehensive list. The next way you can grow your own mushrooms is through container growing. So this is very similar to what we saw with the log and stump growing, except for you're using like a 5-gallon bucket. From what I saw from this way of growing, you do have to treat the substrate that's inside the bucket, so it's a particular pH. And then you drill holes in the side of the bucket, and you inoculate that substrate with the mushroom spawn that you're going after. And then you keep it in a humid place, and the mushrooms will start to grow out of it. You can use containers that aren't buckets. You can use things like crates and other containers that are similar. The substrate people tend to use sawdust and straw, but they've experimented with other substrates. For certain mushrooms, they might have different recommendations. A lot of the tutorials for how to do this process you can find on Northspore or online. People have been cultivating mushrooms for a very, very long time, so they have a lot of really good tips and a how-to guide on how to do this. The next way to grow mushrooms is probably the easiest and what I have done in the past. And this is using fruiting blocks or spray and grow kits. So on the left, that is the spray and grow kit. And then on the right, those are fruiting blocks. So with these spray and grow kits, they give you this block. Usually it's inside a box, and you make some holes in the bag that the substrate is in, and then you spray it down with water every day, and mushrooms will grow from the block. And again, this is a process where after the first flush of mushrooms, you can get more mushrooms. If you soak the substrate again and let it rest for a little bit, more mushrooms will eventually come out. One thing I will say is you should learn how to grow, how to harvest the mushrooms at the right time. The first time I did one of these kits, I let the mushrooms grow and I was watching them get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then by the time I picked them, they were super fibrous. It's better to pick them when they're a little bit smaller. With these fruiting blocks, these can be very diverse too, and these are things that you can buy from companies like Northspore or Joy Grow, and it's inoculated with the mycelium in this block, very similar to the spray and grow kits, but you can make these racks in your house like this person did. And one of the ways that you can control the humidity and the airflow is by making what is called a Martha's tent. And this is a process that mushroom growers have kind of perfected over the years of a humidity controlled chamber where you wrap plastic around this rack where you grow your mushrooms. With the spray and grow kits, if your home isn't super humid, sometimes it helps to put a bag over it. In my experience, I just keep it next to the kitchen sink, and the humidity and kind of spraying of water going up will help them grow a little bit more. But these are all really good options for growing mushrooms. I do want to go a little bit into a couple kinds of mushrooms that are really common for people to grow. So if we go back, I'll go back a couple slides to this one. So there are a lot of options for when you're using log inoculation. So you can grow shiitake mushrooms, oyster mushrooms, lion's mane, chestnut, chicken of the woods, hen of the woods, reishi mushrooms. When you get down to these kits, there's a couple less options. The most common type of mushroom people propagate are oyster mushrooms. And these are considered probably the best beginner mushroom. They're super commonly sold in these kits, the spray and grow kits, and they often provide options for what color of mushroom you want. They have subtly different tastes, and some of them are a little bit hardier if maybe you think your home isn't as humid. But they are known for being delicate and savory. With mushrooms, people tend to cook them up, or you can dry them out and kind of crush them up and keep them as a powder that you season things with. But these are probably the most common mushroom that people propagate in their own home. Another type of mushroom, this isn't super popular yet, but I see it's kind of an up and coming mushroom, is the chestnut mushroom. And these mushrooms grow in clusters similar to the oyster mushrooms, and they are said to have a nutty taste. They also stay crunchy when you cook them. So people like that flavor profile and that texture. but they can be a little bit trickier to grow. There may be more of a beginner intermediate mushroom to grow. And then the last type of mushroom I'll mention is the lion's mane mushroom. And this is a super awesome mushroom. It doesn't look anything like our ideal mushroom that I talked about before. It has those spines rather than gills or a cap. These are another really good beginner mushroom. People have said before they even open up the kit, the mushrooms are already starting to bulge out of there. One thing though, these guys tend to dry out pretty quick in their kits and in their blocks. So watering it down pretty often is important. With lion mane mushrooms, they have a sweeter taste and they're often used as a seafood substitute, especially based on the texture and the taste. People use it to replace crab meat and lobster. So it's really good for vegans out there. Lion's mane is also known for being something that kind of stimulates the brain. It's being used a lot in supplements now. People also use dried lion's mane as a coffee substitute. I believe they call it mud water. I have not tried that. I have no idea if that is something that would be a good substitute for coffee if it tastes good, but it is an option. Mushrooms are often overlooked just because people tend to associate mushrooms with those, button mushrooms that you buy at the store. And if you don't like those button mushrooms, you don't think you like mushrooms. But really mushrooms, there's a lot of different types of mushrooms and they have an incredibly diverse taste profile. So lion's mane tastes sweet. There are some mushrooms like hen of the woods that are supposed to be peppery in taste. So if you think you don't like mushrooms, I would suggest trying a different mushroom. They're pretty versatile and interesting to try. So I did include this. It's a different brand than the grow kits that I was showing before, but you can just have these over your kitchen sink, and then as you're cooking, cut off the mushrooms that you want to use and saute them up however you want. One advantage to propagating your own mushrooms in your house is that you're not going to get those little bugs that tend to get on the mushrooms when they're outside. But I think this is a really cool way of making food at home that a lot of people haven't thought about in the past. And with that, I think we will take some questions. I think Jeff has probably been answering some in chat, but we'll go ahead and look at some more.
Yes, indeed. So a couple of questions have come through here. First was, how far away do other trees and shrubs or plants have to be to not be affected by the juglone produced by the black walnut trees? And I'm going to look this up and try to include a link in the follow-up, but I think it's at least outside the drip line of the tree. But again, I'll try to find that link because I know that there's several different plants that are more susceptible or more tolerant to the juglones, and then some are really, really sensitive. And so I think to be safe, you certainly want to keep it outside of the drip line, maybe even a 6-foot buffer beyond that. Lorena said the beer is quite good, the black walnut beer. She had some about a month ago at the Agroforestry Institute in Columbia, and that's such a great, great place. Sam wants to know, hey, where could a homeowner find hazelnut shrubs to purchase? And I was just typing here, many of the glossy catalogs, what do I mean by that? Think of Forest Keeling or Oikios or Gertens or some of those different ones are going to have hazelnut shrubs that you could potentially purchase. One of the best sources for folks is the Iowa DNR nursery. So you can get bundles of 25 high quality seedlings. I think they're like $1 a piece, something like that. So that's a really good option for folks. And if 25 are too many, well, give some away to your friends or
or whatnot, or I can help you get rid of those too. So keep that in mind. But the Iowa State Forest Nursery is a great place to get lots of different tree and shrub species. They have pecans and hickories and um, hazelnuts, certainly, all sorts of different things. So, okay, let's see what else we have here. Don't be bashful, folks. If you have a question, be sure to get it in. Oh, do you plan to touch on walnut wilt? Leanne, honestly, no, I wasn't planning that because I don't know too much about that. The main concern that we have with black walnuts is a disease called thousand cankers disease. And that's something that has affected the black walnuts. It's not as prevalent right now, but certainly it is a concern because black walnuts are in all 99 of our counties. So, hey, Gina, question here for you. Can mushrooms grow on dead ash?
I believe looking at that list that I found online, there were a couple that are compatible with dead ash. I see that she also asked about applewood. I can't remember from that list, but I know that morel mushrooms really like to grow in former apple orchards. So when those trees are dying, a lot of the time that's a prime place to look for mushrooms. So I imagine that would be compatible with other mushrooms as well.
Okay.
And then I see that Mary Ellen also asked if there was a particular mixture for the straw and the sawdust. And I'm not quite sure about that. I think it might depend on the mushroom that you're trying to grow. People also debate how much of the, they call it mushroom spawn, to add to that mixture as well. But there are a lot of guides on websites like North Spore where they give kind of a breakdown on what they recommend.
Okay, great questions there. Walnut wilt is a disorder in plants like tomato. Ah, okay, caused by the juggalo. Thank you, Leanne, I appreciate that. Any other questions out there? Well, some things that are going to be coming up real soon. Well, I mentioned the honeyberries. They're already done. So as far as some of those fruits go, the honeyberries are done. But the next one's coming up here. We're looking at August. So Aronia berries should be starting to ripen up. Hazelnuts will be starting here at the end of August, first part of September. They'll be starting to ripen up. And then we get into later season. Things like pecans are going to be much later, sometime in maybe October, November, depending on where you're at, certainly. But yeah, it's an exciting time here. We're right in the thick of summer where lots of things are growing. One last call for questions. Otherwise, we're going to wrap things up. Again, this is recorded, and so we will be sure to send out the link once we post this. I'll dig a little bit for some of that walnut wilt information for the juggalones. Include that in that. And then something I wanted to mention as well, coming up here in November, I mentioned that's when we're going to be, when pecan harvest is going on, but that's also the Iowa Nature Summit. And so that's going to be a great opportunity for folks to, I believe it's going to be at, Drake University, and come out and learn about some of the things going on in nature, some of the presentations. It's going to be a great time. Trees Forever plans on having a booth there. I think the Iowa Nut Growers as well. So come and talk to some nutty people and some tree huggers, and it'll be a lot of fun. Now some questions are rolling in here. So sawdust. Nope. What's a good resource for understanding walnut varieties? Mary Ellen, great question. Again, the university down at Columbia, actually Trees Forever has a nice document that provides a little bit of information on growing black walnuts, a landowner's guide to perennial crop options, certainly. And so I would point you in those directions. And of course, you can do a Google search and see what you might be able to find. As far as those that are doing research on black walnuts, certainly it's going to be the University of Missouri down there at their Harf Center. amongst others. But black walnuts, that's about it. Now you get into regular English or Carpathian walnuts, and certainly you can find information at UC Davis out in California for that. Any other fruits recommended for Iowa other than Aronia? Well, absolutely. So there's pawpaws, there's persimmons, there's elderberries, the honeyberries. I didn't get into some of those, but maybe that'll be version 2. I'll have to take a deep dive into some of those different species that we have there. And some of them are great, are a little bit more off the beaten path. So, you know, how often do you get a pawpaw, a fresh ripe pawpaw? Not very often, because they don't really have the best shelf life. But if you get one that's ripe, it's really delicious. So Leanne wants to know, how much space do we need for planting nut trees or berries? Could you plant them in a narrow residential lot? Say maybe 40 by 100. Well, that's really going to depend on what you're growing. So some of these smaller, like the honeyberries, even the hazelnuts perhaps, or the elderberries, they might be a little bit more compact, where you can space them out maybe 6 feet between the shrub. But other larger trees, certainly if we get into the pecans or what else, hickories or some of those things, they're going to be eventually large trees. So then you can also get that layered effect too. So get those shade trees or those larger trees going, and then you can put some of those understory fruit trees perhaps below them, and then have a layered effect there. Let's see here. Where can Iowa native pawpaws be sourced that are not grafted? Boy, that's a tough one. Tom Wall at Red Fern Farm is a place that I would reach out to. Well, someone who's done actually quite a bit of research with pawpaws is Patrick O'Malley. And so he's a fantastic resource. He's a horticultural extension agent down in Johnson County, that's Iowa City. He would be a great person to talk to about pawpaws, is Patrick. Let's see. I think there might be a pawpaw group. I'd have to look. No, let me see what I can dig out, see if I can find a link for that. Carla, we'll see what we can find out for you. Okay, I think we've hit the end of the list here. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Certainly, I encourage you to check out our Trees Forever calendar of events. We have a lot of great events coming up here soon. Check out the webinars, the in-person field days coming up in August, and join us for some fun and fellowship with other growers. With that, hey, everyone have a great day and stay cool. We'll talk to you later.